Thank you, Dr. Stretter, for joining us today to talk about comparative writing and compare and contrast essays in development of Western Civ. So my first question for you is, DWC essays often involve comparing texts that can be quite different from one another. For example, the Bible with something by Homer like the Odyssey or Iliad. What advice would you give to students who are struggling to make meaningful connections between such texts in their writing?
So my main suggestion would be to focus. A prompt that asks you to compare something like the Bible and Homer is something you could write an entire book on, and entire books have been written on things like that. You are likely to only have 2 to 5 or 6 pages. So it's really important to find a specific point of comparison that's interesting, that you think is worth talking about. Don't try to compare justice in the Bible and Homer. Try to find some particular interesting example of the type of justice, for example, in the Garden of Eden scene that you see in Genesis, and compare it to the type of justice that you see at the end of the Odyssey when Odysseus slaughters the suitors. I mean, even that is a fairly big topic, so you might even need to go more narrow. I would say less is more when it comes to comparing 2 big texts.
Students often learn about point by point versus subject by subject analysis for how to formulate their essays. Do you think one of these methods of comparison is better than the other, or are they both useful in different cases?
I think it depends a lot on the assignment and on the writer. Some people are able to do a point by point really effectively. Others are more comfortable with a subject by subject. In general, I might suggest, especially for short writing assignments, subject by subject, where you'd be looking at one text first and then the second text next, as long as the last subject that you talk about is clearly linked to the first subject. The problem with the kind of half and half structure is that you have papers where someone will say, in the Odyssey, for example, this happens, and then in the Bible, this happens, but without a clear connection between them. So point by point can sometimes be easier for linking the two, but I think for a short writing assignment, subject by subject works well as long as you're referring back to the first subject in the second half of the essay.
So last question, quote integration is obviously very important when writing a compare and contrast essay between 2 works of literature, as we were discussing. And I think some students struggle a little bit to get used to the idea of integrating quotes into their essays. What do you notice as the most common student mistakes regarding quote integration, and how can they be fixed?
I mean, one of the most common is simply a total lack of integration. So simply putting a quote as a standalone sentence. I think of the quotes that are just kind of dropped in by themselves as lonely quotes, that they need some hand-holding. They need you to introduce them to your reader. And so having some sort of introductory phrase, followed usually by a comma or a colon, and then the quotation, and then crucially saying something afterwards about the quote. Don't assume the quote speaks for itself. I tell students to be sure that you say at least 2 things for every one thing that the quote says. So you need to say something to set it up, then you need to do the quote, and then you need at least 1 sentence afterwards explaining why it's interesting, why it's important. There's a million things you could quote from the text, so you need to make it clear why you've chosen this thing and how it supports whatever you're trying to argue.
Great, thank you so much. Those are some great tips for students working on these comparative essays. I hope that they will find it very helpful.
Sure, I hope so. Thank you.